Jane Yellowlees Douglas.
Victoria, could you give me warnings at like 8 minutes, 6, 4, and 2? Sorry, I need to be really anal about this because otherwise I'm not going to get through it. Just a hand signal when it goes to 8, 8, 6, 4, and 2. So I just want to make sure I get to the stuff that matters. So I'm going to have to hopscotch through a bunch of stuff. Some of the questions that have been asked are what do tools do to us? I'm not going to talk about tools at all, and I'm going to use the French deconstructivist notion of text, which is that it can be anything that gives rise to an experience. So this will have implications for text, film, for interactivity. In the late 1990s, I got interested in the difference between immersive versus engaging experiences with a colleague who teaches at UC Davis. We're both in colleges of business, although I'm schizo, and I also have an appointment in clinical and translational science. Again, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to talk quickly to get through all this stuff. We got interested in the difference between it being engaged in something and being immersed in something. And we came up with different axes, and I tried to do due diligence for this talk because I'm anal and I am tenured, although it's more like the Hunger Games being tenured. No, it's not a good gig anymore. But I ended up sending me back to my original paper where we defined what these were. And so the notion is schemas are very effective. We all know, if you can think back to the work that Bob Skulls did at the Yale AI Institute in the late 1970s, that schemas give us a script for how to interact with something, and schemas are profoundly enabling in that you can't understand, for example, three-dimensional perspective without a schema. So it goes all the way back. One of the best instantiations, really, of the description of schema goes back to E.H. Gombrich, Art and Illusion, if you want to see a fantastic illustration of schemas at work. And I see I'm being penalized for being a Mac user for some weird reason, because this is asked backwards. The bar's got this interesting flip, so when you take pictures of this, it looks like I can't write. But the notion is that you want to not break frame if something is immersive, and that the schema, mild incongruity with the schema, actually increases your immersion. And what we found was when we did EEGs of people reading really crappy airport paperbacks, their cognitive load was high. Why was it high? It was continuous because they were immersed in the book. If you hand that same person Finnegan's Wake, it drops to relatively low because they're doing a lot of thinking and wondering what's going on and what on earth am I reading and why do I even read this unless it's been assigned for a course. And then on the other end of the spectrum is something that's engaging, and it can be triggered by high schema incongruity, and that sometimes things are non-intuitive. You've got difficult cutscenes if you're talking about digital gaming. You've got a narrative that you've got to do too much fuffing around with tools. If you don't do anything, nothing happens. If you're cack-handed with using a controller, you're not a Twitch player, not very much happens. So it's not a very immersive environment at all. It's a highly engaging environment. It's great. And with time, you skill up and you arrive at what we're going to get to next. And if I did have time for something like a Q&A, I would ask for you to say which of these would be engaging or immersive or whatever. The Girl on the Train, for example, would be immersive. It's a quick read. You're drawn into it. The Wasteland would be highly engaging because if Eliot hadn't published his footnotes, you wouldn't understand what the hell was going on with the Wasteland, so he helped us all out by giving us footnotes. Memento, you have to figure out the structure and the scheme and what's going on. First-person shooters depends. The one at the very bottom of the list is, I was glad to see, has been made available for the iOS. Jordan Mechner made a boatload off of Prince of Persia and the franchises, but virtually no one ever saw this game. You can buy it for the iOS. I recommend you do. I used to teach game studies. It's absolutely fabulous because you're interacting with the Orient Express in 1914. You understand the origins of World War I by interacting with this characters on a train, all of whom are speaking different languages. And if you do nothing, shit happens. It's fantastic. It really is. You get thrown off the train, you get arrested, and the outcome gets reported in somebody's diary, and the diary scrap comes up. Just to amuse myself last night, I played a bit of it because I wasn't paying attention, and something happened, and they discovered there was a body in a cabin, and the next thing you know, it reminds me, it would be really nice if you did do something. You need to find this person before a certain point. So we get to what Csikszentmihalyi described, and literature going back into the 1960s describes that high-performance athletes enter what gets roughly described as a flow state. That is the nexus of immersion and engagement. It has distinctive neurophysiology involved that's implied, and I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to what it does to the body. So there is no such thing as a brain-body problem. And I have published work in ophthalmology journals and endocrinology journals about the profound impacts of your bone marrow interacting with your central nervous system and what it does to the brain. So that'll be where I'll get to in a minute. What happens with a flow state is, and this is just a classic definition, the reason this is a god-awful PowerPoint deck is so that this can be uploaded on the Google Drive and you guys can look at it at your leisure, rather than listening to me talking at light speed. But you're fully immersed in the task. We have this weird distortion with time, which is consistent with what also happens under hypnosis. I'm very interested in some of these alternative states because I've induced hypnosis and we've looked at some of my variables under hypnosis. This is also what your brain does on meditation. It's what it does in a flow state. So you will notice that time in here has been elastic. Some sessions you're amazed, holy shit, that was 10 minutes. Some of them it was like, that's not 10 minutes yet. You have an elasticity to time no matter what we're doing, but when you're deeply immersed in something at which you're highly skilled, time becomes incredibly plastic. And we're very interested in what this does. So you're not aware of the fact that you've moved or that you've done anything or that you've been breathing. If you watch a film or something like that, you enter a flow state. You don't have to necessarily be highly skilled. But you have to be at least deeply versed enough in something, and the schemas have to be clearly enough flagged and draw you in sufficiently that you enter this kind of state where you're not that aware of yourself. And so there's been these other models of what flow states look like. Let me just get to some of these. Okay, so we know that there's this long performance of what your brain looks like in a deeply immersed state that's like a flow state. So there isn't a lot of crosstalk between the amygdala, which is the excitatory part of the deep brain. There is very minimal chatter between the hippocampi and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is relatively quiet. To some extent, parietal and occipital lobes are quiet. That's unusual. You can flash auditory, you can flash lights at someone. They're relatively blind to visual cues. They're relatively deaf to auditory cues under this kind of state. The problem is, it's hard for us to capture this state. Why? One alternative is EEGs. If you've got a performance athlete, you obviously can't swim with the EEGs on. You're going to fry the electrodes. You're capturing only 9 microvolts, which is like a battery, and it's only capturing the cortex. So you're not capturing what's going on in the deep brain, which is highly significant. Problem with fMRI studies, their time resolution is absolutely crap. It's about 3 seconds. We know that for word recognition, you're looking at 50 milliseconds. So it's a terrible time resolution. The only thing that's kind of good out there is MEGs. They're prohibitively expensive. Try and get somebody to fund that. What we can do is we know that over time, with neuroplasticity, you can do brain imaging and see that somebody who practices, say, meditation or does gaming chronically will have brain changes over time that can be observable. But what we don't see are systemic changes that you can do that can upregulate your own immune response and can actually change the way your brain is essentially changing your body's responsiveness to an inflammatory state, for example. And so what I did was, this is an ancillary finding, this is why I got involved in the N=1 issue. I have a friend who's an absolutely brilliant stem cell geneticist, and because I have crazy stem cells, I enrolled and let them take blood from me for a day. And they were interested in my circadian clock. My stem cells are at up 10 plus, and they wanted me to replicate my circadian rhythm, so they asked me to work out at 2 o'clock in the morning like I normally would. When I came into the lab, they recognized that it was the highest level of CD34 positive cells ever recorded in whole human blood. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute. These have implications for diabetic wound healing, for revascularization, for collagenesis, even as adjuvant therapy, potentially for chemotherapy, if you can mindfully upregulate CD34 positive cells. That's just what the experimental design looked like. So I'm going to just show you what some of this data looked like on patients so you can see what these levels look like. So we've got 15,000 CD34 positives. This is where we're looking at the release of nitric oxide and the upregulation of these pluripotent stem cells over the course of this 24-hour period. So I wanted you to see all the data, so it's transparent as I can make it. So you're seeing high levels are 10,000, 10,000, 10,000, 4,000, 10,000, 8,000, 12,000. And then you get to this. What's great is this was me. So I know what I was doing. So I turned up and they asked me, what on earth were you doing between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m.? And the answer was, the bandwidth in the hospital is comparatively quiet, so I could stream film. I went to film school. My aunt is also Maggie Smith. I grew up around actors. I can get profoundly stimulated with watching really good acting, and I was watching phenomenal acting. And I was unaware of where I was, and that is the kind of state that you will consistently be in when you're very good at something. If you're to play in a symphony, if you're a writer and you're really in the zone, as we would call it, you're a high-performance athlete, or you're in a meditative type state, or under hypnosis, your brain is exactly like this. The neuroanatomy of these states is very similar. So we think that it could have potentially really interesting implications for, say, somebody who's a diabetic patient and is having a problem with wound healing, or potentially as an adjuvant therapy for somebody undergoing chemo, radiation therapy, has an autoimmune disorder. So the interesting thing is, how do we build tools that enable us to enter these kinds of states? Ideally, I wanted to involve a Twitch game player, somebody who is seasoned in doing transcendental meditation and had practiced daily, and I had my CD34 positives looked at under hypnosis too. So this data is very preliminary. The interesting thing about this is data that's durable. We're not just catching a tiny snippet in time. We're looking at effects over the body over a 24-hour cycle, but you could measure these longitudinally over weeks or months, and we could design tools that potentially support this kind of use. Okay. I got there. If you didn't understand any of that, this stuff will be on Google Drive. You can at least go back and look at the PowerPoints.
Now, basically, when we had a communication about this earlier, you put it in a slightly sexier way. Can you repeat that?
I have no idea what I said.
You were talking about how gaming, basically.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, essentially, if you, and I was also, I was the expert witness and one of the consultants behind the amicus curiae brief on Schwarzenegger versus the Merchants Association, for those of you unfamiliar with the U.S. Supreme Court system. I was the friend of court who said that if you took games away from people, they would kill people. They would not kill people because you gave them games to play with. So I noticed that, if you were manufacturing computer games, you could manufacture games that would let people de-stress. A lot of people who are Twitch players find that playing with a first-person shooter or in any of these gaming environments, that's how they de-stress at the end of a particularly stressful day. If you were mindful, you would interact. The healthcare system in this country, as we know, is in shreds, if not completely gone over the cliff. You would interact with other members of in a network with the healthcare system and with game design to create some kind of platform that could act as adjuvant therapy or act in concert with people who have chronic disease. Yeah, Robert.
That was very interesting. I guess my question is, when they were measuring your CD34 level, how could you maintain the flow if they were sampling your blood every 15 or 30 minutes?
That's an excellent question. I was also under really high stress, which would just about crucify your CD34 positive levels because they're correlated with being unstressed. And I had someone ring me up while I was in the hospital and tell me my dog needed to be put to sleep that I'd had for 15 years. So I was freaking out about that, and they'd taken so much blood out of me that my veins were collapsing because I donated so much blood for my stem cells that I was, at that point, had to be hospitalized for anemia. They'd taken so much blood away. So I was in a really bad way physically. I should never have had those values. You can do, one of the things is a focus state, and for those of you not familiar with his work, you really should be. Richard Davidson's work out of University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was one of the first affective neuroscientists who looks at positive emotion, and some of you in the audience should definitely take his test, because I can tell you're deeply unfocused, and you need to work on that shit. And you can upregulate focus mindfully, and you can upregulate, and you can use that focus state to get to this flow state as well. It's a concentrated act of attention in which you become invisible to yourself. And Davidson's work has been absolutely invaluable for understanding that piece of the puzzle too. I talked so fast nobody actually understood what I was saying. It's good, that's what the PowerPoint deck is for. It's not for me to read off of it, it's for as an artifact.
How long did it take you to learn to pronounce Csikszentmihalyi?
I had to listen to his little clip 3 times.
it seems like you would need someone who can go in and out of the flow state at will, would be a helpful person to experiment on, perhaps?
Yes, yeah, you could induce it mindfully. It would take practice.
Well, I can do it, so we can talk about that.
Sure.
What about curing leukemia?
It would be used as an adjuvant therapy, certainly, but I do know somebody who does hypnotherapy, and she was a biochemist. And what she does is she takes the stage 4 patients, and everyone's given up hope on, and I was one of the given up hope on people. I'm a medical freak. And we used hypnosis for her to implant suggestions. You can implant suggestions, for example, to your macrophages and your white blood cells. It sounds completely demented. It does work. She's had so many people who should have been dead who are now doing triathlons, and she worked with me. Yeah.
What's your thought on Jane McGonigal and Super Better?
I think I wish she hadn't written it.
Oh, tell me.
Well, I think she's so ridiculously simplistic and so divorced from any meaningful data that she gives gaming people a really terrible name, and it's the reason why digital humanities gets demonized, because it makes them all look like lazy shitheads. Sorry, I have Tourette's syndrome. My frontal lobe is disinhibited. But really, it's so ridiculous. It's very simplistic. I mean, these tools, you've seen how sophisticated some of these tools are. It's not like let's all put our hands in the air. Doesn't that make you feel better? Really? You know? Do you need something sophisticated to make you feel that way? Good design is really expensive, and it takes a long time. And it takes a lot of requirements capture and a lot of mindfulness to get those details exactly right and understand what the schemas are and support them.
We have time for one more question while we flip over. Oh, come on, there's got to be some more curiosity.
I won't swear at you if you ask me a question, I promise.
This is the physiological...
And I won't ridicule you. I mean, I really wasn't ridiculing you. It's just Jane McGonigal. I want to slap her. Sorry.
Oh, over here. Okay. Yeah, right here.
We have one at the back of the room. What? Frodo can handle that. He's
We're
got
all going to be putting them in a Google Drive. The address will be on the screen tomorrow, but if you can't be here tomorrow, I will email it to all of you.
We had one other question?
Yes, a quick question.
Yeah.
Where does all of this sit relative to understanding and potentially improving treatments for people with mental illnesses?
It's already being widely used with PTSD, as we know. It actually has good applications, somewhat, for PTSD, because you can use habituation to an extent. It's hard to tell the extent to which we can upregulate or downregulate some of these things. I think our knowledge of neurotransmitters is still so provisional. And also, some mental illness is virus-driven and is driven by inflammation. If it's virally driven and you're past a certain point, if you're infected with T. gondii and you have schizophrenia and nobody gets to you in the first 3 or 4 weeks with antibiotics, you're kind of going to be schizophrenic without you being on meds. So it depends on whether it's an inflammatory state or a viral state, too.
Thank you very much.